All right, finally to our episode on the problem of evil. Ready for it?
Let's go.
All right. So real quick, tell us, where have we been so far with this whole... It's been kind of a long series, actually, longer than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, so we've been arguing for, at least discussing, I don't know if we've been arguing, but we've been discussing the possibility that creation was not out of ex nihilo, but out of ex materia, that the biblical authors really were focused on not the how of creation, but the why of creation, and the assumption. They're not necessarily teaching creation ex materia, but they're assuming that. We saw that in Genesis 1 as we walked through the creation narrative, that everything that was formed out of something.
Yeah. And in the same way that they imagined that the world was flat inside of a bubble, you know.
Right. I mean, this is their assumptions. Doesn't necessarily mean it's reality, but this is the biblical author's assumptions, and I think it's worth at least discussing. Maybe they were right. Maybe there is some truth to the way that they were assuming that the world functioned. But at the end of the day, like we said, we keep saying over and over, that was not their purpose. Their purpose was not to answer all of our modern questions. Their purpose was to really help humanity understand our purpose.
Yeah. Understand the how.
Understand the why. Yeah.
The how.
Yeah. Exactly.
And I like that we said in the last episode that it, in particular, is helping us understand our place in the family of God when He creates it. Because I've said too, I think in the podcast and also in the kind of the climax of the book, as I'm talking about this, it's that creation is not about creation of material out of nothing, but the creation of a people to be God's ruling family in His presence.
Exactly.
So every creation throughout the book of Genesis climaxes with a new people.
Right.
They're God's people that are going to be the means of redemption and further creation.
Yeah, and even in the New Testament, I mean, Paul calls us the new creation, and obviously we haven't come out of nothing.
Yeah. All right, well, let's get into the actual, problem of evil stuff here. We actually hashed out a lot of this in the previous episode, so go check that out if you're wrestling with what does this mean for just how we think about God and creation. Yeah, go check that one out. But this one I'm excited for because I think the worldview of creation ex materia, the meaning of that worldview, really gives a profound and, to me, satisfying answer for the world we live in, because it's a messed up place. Things are not great at the moment.
Yeah, and I remember when you first started talking to me about this, I mean, like months ago, this was kind of the driving force behind you really diving into this topic and trying to better understand it. And so, it's good that we are kind of climaxing with this idea. So do we want to start with just some of the more traditional answers to the problem of evil? First of all, let's define the problem of evil. Like, what do we even mean by that?
Okay, yeah. So the problem of evil is basically we're asking, with the evil in the world, and based on the state that creation was in before creation began, was God good to make this world with the sovereignty that He had, with the material or lack thereof that He was working with? Is God still good? That's the question. Yeah,
so we see that there's evil in the world. We are told in the Bible that God is both good and that He is sovereign. How can all three of those things be true?
Right.
And so that therein lies the problem.
Yeah, and so you'll hear maybe the word theodicy thrown around. It's the exercise of theologians trying to justify God. That's what the theodicy means. And so I think really creation ex materia just undermines the exercise of theodicy in a good way. I guess you all can determine if I'm right on that or not, or you can see if you agree.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the traditional views, how they traditionally answer the problem of evil.
Okay, so to start off with creation ex nihilo, everything was essentially perfect before creation because it was just God in the Trinity and perfect love, according to people like Augustine. That's who really formulated that thought, and it's carried forth in a lot of our Christian traditions today. And then we also need to talk about the purpose of creation. And the purpose of creation, and this has some different ways that it's articulated, but I think usually it's the purpose of creation was to have a people who can praise God for His glory. That's the purpose of creation. So you start off with God in a perfect state of just love within the Trinity, and then He goes to create a people who will be with him and his family and praise, and they will be in a state of love, not just among the Trinity, but within God and his human family as well. And they exist for his glory. So if before creation, God was in perfect love with the Trinity, everything was perfect and there was no need of anything, it was just God and himself, and then the world is made and there's all this evil and bad things happening and suffering and people going to hell and just all those things. And then at the end, God has a remnant who is a family that loves and honors him and is in communion with him and glorifies him. Then how is God sovereign with all this suffering and evil and other things in the middle, and also still a good God to go from the beginning to the end?
Yeah, so traditionally there's several different ways that people have answered this. I think one common answer is that there's a greater good argument that's out there, and they would use passages like at the end of Genesis with Joseph, where he says to his brothers, "What you meant for evil, God meant for good." And so they would argue that the evil that we see in this world ultimately will turn out to be good. And obviously there's some mystery in how that happens and what that means, and where did evil come from, and did God create evil, and there's a lot of things that they've got to wrestle with. And so those who are high on God's sovereignty maybe they won't go as far as saying that God created evil, but he's at least allowed it and ordained it, is some of the language that they would use. And then those who are more geared towards human responsibility and free will would say that, yeah, God created it all, but we've just messed it up. And so the ripple effects of the fall and sin have impacted everything in the universe. And so that's why we've got so much evil. And so obviously, there's been books written about this. We can't go into all the nuances between all the different variations of the answer to the problem of evil. Well, I mean, if I did, then no, not even close. Not even close. It's a problem for a reason. That's why we call it a problem. And so, why don't we from here let you talk about the answer that Ex Materia has for the problem of evil?
Yeah. So I think that really the pre-creation state reframes the entire question, I think. And that's why I said earlier that I think that creation ex materia kind of undermines the question of the problem of evil, the exercise of trying to justify God, Theodicy. And that is because with creation ex nihilo, you have perfection with God, and then you have a lot of suffering, and then you have a spot where things are good again at the end. And, why even start the process if everyone wouldn't have been around to even know that there was good at the end, and they wouldn't have to experience the suffering? Why not just let well enough alone and not do the whole exercise of creation? Well, with creation ex materia, there's actually a need for something to be done. Things were not fantastic at the beginning. There was actually everything in a state of ruin, in a state of formless and void. Actually, the tohu vavohu, wild and waste, chaos and ruin. And so God, when he comes to this and begins to form it, he's taking what is bad and making it into something good. He's making a place for himself to dwell with a family that he's going to make. And that family, us, we are a necessary part of this act of bringing bad into good, because we talked about before on some of our earlier episodes from books by John Walton, G.K. Beale, they show that humans are supposed to take the goodness of the garden and expand it out into that which was still ruined wasteland and chaotic waters and things like that. So we are God's instruments, the means by which he is going to continue turning the bad into good. So we're a necessary part of that. That explains our existence. There's still maybe some more questions you could ask about, why are we the means? But regardless, that's there's a purpose for our creation in that. And so in that, we don't go from a state of perfection to really bad to good again. We go from a state of not good progressively up to very good at the end.
So what you're saying is that the problem of evil is answered because the default of the world was not good. And it's not that the default of the world was necessarily evil to begin with, but it was in a place of ruin and destruction. And so what God is doing then is forming what was a mess into something beautiful. But the process of that, in the process of that, there's going to be, it's going to be messy. Like it's not going to be like when you form a pot, like it's dirty, it's messy,
Well, I think even beyond that, so outside the garden, it was still, wasteland and associated with death and Sheol and the waters that are connected to Sheol and all those things. And so whenever you're outside the garden, which we are, you expect, if that land is associated with death, there's going to be bad things. There's hostile creatures out here. We are, sick and dying. There's all of these things in the world that are bad because we are coming into contact with the hostile pre-creation environment. God has not come to this space yet and made it all good because we're outside the garden.
Right. And so this still maintains God's sovereignty over everything. It's just... And actually, go ahead.
I was going to say, along with his sovereignty, why doesn't he come just, snap his fingers and zap everything good already? Well, part of that is, in the biblical imagination, whenever God comes and cleanses a place, that which is bad gets wiped away. And right now we're part of the bad. And so that's part of the waiting is, yes, we are in a state where Christ has come and cleansed us, at least those who believe. There's still plenty who don't, and God wishes that there would be none who perish. And so... that kind of explains our waiting a little bit, too, is when God comes to cleanse, the flood was cleansing. So he's cleansing by a flood, essentially. That which is unclean gets washed away, not rinsed off and kept, necessarily. So that, I think that aspect of that worldview explains why we experience these things that are kind of associated with death, and they're not good. And it also explains why we wait and why the fact that God's long-suffering and his patience is a mercy and not a cruelty.
And I think it does also, I guess, almost make the assumption that humans do have free will in the sense that we can choose to do what is against God's desire and God's will, which is what we see from the very beginning in Genesis, I believe.
Yeah, we talked about the episode right before, or in our Genesis 22 segment, about how God sets forth tests for his creatures because he wants us to rule. He wants us to be rulers in his creation. And so he sets forth a test to see, are these people going to be loyal to me? Are they going to take their wisdom from the source of all wisdom or try to make their own and, essentially have to go out into the unclean place because if they stay here, they're going to turn this whole project into a crapshoot. That's... And so there, I think within this, there's still the debate that has to be had about sovereignty versus free will. How exactly do we see that?
Right.
But there are obviously places in the Scripture where God sets forth a test, and he has not pre-programmed the result.
No. And he may influence the result. And even in like Abraham's story where he puts forth the final exam, the test of, are you going to sacrifice your own son? I fully believe that God was preparing him for that final exam throughout his whole life, showing him over and over his faithfulness to keep his promises, to the point where Abraham actually literally believed that God would bring his son back to life if he sacrificed him. But at the end of the day, Abraham still had to make a choice.
Right. Yeah, one where he'd been grown beforehand by God to be prepared for that situation. And God was his help all along the way. But God didn't reach into his heart and flip a switch and say, today you're going to be faithful. Tomorrow maybe not. But,
Right.
It seems that there is a genuine relationship between humanity and God in Genesis and throughout the Bible.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe with that, should we talk about, is this the best version of reality? Because I think that's another problem you run into in this whole discussion. I think it's part of the puzzle.
So in the ex nihilo view, you have to make the argument, like if God is sovereign and God is good, he created, and God knows the future, God created the best possible universe, and again, within there, how free is our will and how sovereign is God and what does that look like? We're not even trying to answer those questions right now. But yeah, in the ex nihilo view, you have to believe that, trust that God's ways are higher than our ways and that he created the best possible universe to save the most possible people and create the best eternal space at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I'll say along with that, whenever I still was trying to make sense of all this and wrestle with this from a creation ex nihilo standpoint, I personally didn't find a lot of the answers to be super satisfying, and that was just me. But I ultimately just came back to the fact that, okay, Jesus made this reality, and he found it worth suffering and dying for in order to save us. And he went through, just as much, if not more, suffering than anyone else has before or after that time. So I think because of that, and seeing his love in what he has done then and the miracles he has done from that time on, I think that we can say, okay, even if I don't understand, I don't have all the pieces, I trust you, Jesus. Your wisdom is higher than mine, and so again, I'm just placing my trust in you, even though I don't personally understand how this is all a good plan.
Right.
And behind this is the assumption that, if God creates ex nihilo, if everything is formed from his own creativity, well, then any version of reality is possible. You can alter the laws of physics. You can alter how humans relate to one another, how humans relate to God. You can alter the way that we learn or experience. We can learn without having to experience, or, all those different things. So with that, it's kind of like, okay, we have endless possibilities, and this is the most loving reality. This is the best reality. Again, there are answers for that, but I think that the question of, is this the best version of reality from an ex materia standpoint?
Yeah, it doesn't. That's not even a question anymore.
Yeah, it's just taken for granted that, well, yes, it is, because this reality, it was already kind of here, a big lump of wasted, terrible, ruinous mass that God took and, again, is in a continual process of making into something that is wonderful and good, that is no longer darkness and ruined land and endless deadly ocean, but just his people in his city of light forever, continuing to rule and reign with him on his throne. All right, so according to the ex materia framework, it just kind of is taken for granted that God is working from a certain point in at creation and just began shaping it with his all-surpassing wisdom to get to the best place. And so it wasn't like, okay, you can start with anything, let's start with something terrible and then make it to good. It was just, hey, we are starting with what we have and making it good. No decision was arbitrary. It's just assumed that this is a version of reality that is absolutely the process of God according to his high wisdom, taking things from bad to good. So let's talk about what is good then. We talked about how, at the end, really in both the ex materia and ex nihilo frameworks, we have God and his human family ruling together in love and glorifying God, him on his throne, sustaining his kingdom as his people serve as vice regents for him, as priest kings, as they did in the Garden of Eden.
So what you're saying is that an ex materia universe, if God created out of the eternal material that was already here, that was ruinous and chaotic, and formed it into something.
Well, and maybe it's not even eternal. It's just assumed that it's there. So.
It's there. Yeah, we don't know. It was there before he started forming it.
It's just the opening scene of the Bible.
Right. So what you're saying is that ex materia erases the problem of evil because the universe was chaotic before creation ever even started.
Right. Yeah, God no longer has created chaos from nothing, but rather it was something that he is coming and taming from the outset.
Right. And so it's not that God ordained evil, or that even so much that humans rebelled and created evil. It's not that we created evil. The evil was already there, and we were kind of created out of it wasn't evil.
Yeah, it just wasn't good.
It wasn't good. The chaos was already there, and so we were created out of that. And because humans have free will, we have chosen over the years to rebel, and because of that, there's been times where we've, out of our own choosing, gone back into the chaos and created more chaos. But even in the midst of that, you see God working.
Yeah, and introduced death into God's throne room, and so we had to step out of it until Christ could come to cleanse us. And now that he has, we're waiting for him to rescue as many as he can and bring us back in. Yeah,
and so at the end of the Bible, we've got this vision of one day God completely creating or recreating what's been ruined into something that will be very good, and that's what we long for.
Absolutely, yeah, and so the chaos and the death and things that we experience, it's just part of that world, part of the ruin that was here before. It's not completely gone yet. God hasn't made it all into the garden yet, so Yeah, that's what we're waiting for.
So God in his infinite wisdom is patiently guiding us to a place where one day he will completely reform the world.
Yeah, and it's not all just an arbitrary exercise for the sake of having a people who will praise him necessarily, too. I think that might be worth mentioning. With Creation ex Materia, we are, again, the instruments that he has used. Our place in the world is to be God's rulers, to spread his goodness out across the wilderness, out across the ruin and the chaos. Whereas with Ex Nihilo, things went from perfection to glory in the end with all this suffering in the middle, but now it's actually things went from bad to creating these people who can be God's vice regents for taming the bad, and then we get the honor of not just being his tools, but living in his throne room, being with him forever, all those things. And so I think it also really just shapes our purpose in the world, and it takes away any question of like, is our existence arbitrary? Did it have to be this way? It actually becomes like, oh, that's awesome. We're the tools that God is using, and not just tools to throw away, but like we are his governors in the process of taking the bad universe and making it good.
Yeah, and in a sense, it still is about his glory, that we are meant to be a reflection of his glory, and that we are here to, and we get to worship him. It's not that he just created us for simply that. We were created for even more than that.
Right. I mean, that goes back to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's, will you, I'm the source of life and the source of wisdom. Will you reflect that out into creation, or are you going to try and take it from somewhere else?
Exactly.
And so, it all does. Like, everything has to point back to him, both because we want to, and he is our creator and the head of our family, and just because he's the source of it. There's no other option. And so it all points back to him in all ways.
Well, I've enjoyed this discussion, and hopefully we haven't confused people too much.
This went a lot better than our first take.
Yeah. This is we have been wrestling with this for a while, and definitely, like I said, I've said numerous times at this point, this is I feel this is way above my pay grade, and it is a whole lot more comfortable and easy for me to just walk through the biblical text and talk about what the original author intended.
Oh, we'll get back to that. For sure.
Yeah,
I'm hoping this was helpful. It has been like a difficult topic to articulate because it's not just we're taking something that's been said 1,000 times, but this hasn't really been talked about a lot, especially not in a pastoral sense. And so we're really trying to wrestle through this as we're talking, especially when we don't have a lot of time to do that. And so a lot of this is kind of off the cuff. But next week we're going to get back into Genesis and start on chapter 24 and talk about the Exodus of Rebekah.
That sounds like a plan.
Awesome. We'll see you all then.